What we've experienced today is a long debate about how we should spend our money. And I've said repeatedly that this is a terrible, rotten, no good way to spend your money. It's a terrible way to budget your money. It's a terrible thing to sort of lurch from deadline to deadline. Basically, Congress lurches all the way to a deadline. We approach midnight and we either up or down on some bill that's decided by a few people, but not by the vast majority. So Congress lurches basically from deadline to deadline. Then Congress waits to the last minute and then gloms all of the spending together in one enormous bill. When that bill comes forward, though, at the very last minute, we're told we don't have enough time to debate and amend the bill. So no one really is allowed to participate in the process other than a few folks behind closed doors. The consequences of this have not been good, I think, for the country. All day long, what we've been requesting and what I've been asking for is simply 15 minutes to have one amendment. And my amendment would have said that we should live within our means, we should live within the budgetary caps that we've set, and try not to add too much debt. We were denied this amendment, even though we've had plenty of time. We probably had time for 40 or 50 amendments today, had we actually allowed this to happen. But make no mistake, the result of this bill today is a bipartisan looting of the Treasury. We are going to now have a bill that expands spending across the board and will lead to trillion-dollar annual deficits. But it doesn't have to be that way. I think the Senate, if it actually tried harder, could do the right thing. If you were passing individual appropriation bills, no one senator would ever stop anything, would ever be able to shut down anything. If we'd done our job, the appropriation bills would have already been passed or be in the process of passing for the following year. And I think it just takes willpower to do it. Everybody you talk to says, oh yeah, we should do it that way. And everybody sort of quietly says, this is the last time I'm voting for a CR or for one of these enormous spending bills. And yet we're on our fourth one this year. And even though I have great complaints about how much debt is going to be added with this, I think we also are finding that we're having another one of these in a month. So really, I think that's what's disconcerting to a lot of us is that we don't go through the process of actually looking for waste in government, going through the committee process, spending the money more wisely. Earlier today, I went through a series of wasteful projects that are out there. Many of them are very similar to wasteful projects that William Proxmire had started noticing in the late 1960s and early 1970s. And yet we still have many of that same waste goes on and on and on. Only 4 times in the last 42 years has Congress actually passed all the appropriation bills. But it's not impossible, even in our modern era. The House this year actually passed all 12 appropriation bills. And yet we didn't have time somehow to take up any of that or do any of our work on our side. But there is real consequences to what happens. And one of the consequences here is that we are accumulating new debt at about $1 million a minute. We have for some time. The new estimates actually are closer to $2 million a minute. It's going to be about $1 trillion a year. And when you look at the debt that was accumulated for the last 17 years or so, George W. Bush doubled the debt from $5 trillion to $10 trillion. President Obama doubled the debt from $10 trillion to $20 trillion. And now we're on course to exceed $30 trillion in the next 7 years or so. So there really are signs that the budget process is broken in the sense that we're always doing these short continuing resolutions, but there's also evidence that we're not being very good stewards of the money in putting all the spending together in one bill at one time. I think the vote tonight is a vote about many things. It's about whether or not you favor a government accumulating so much debt. It's about whether you can reckon that with your conscience when you, for many of us, complained for years and years about the $1 trillion annual deficits of President Obama. And it really is also a litmus test of conservatism, because some of us have maintained for years that we're fiscally conservative, go home to our states and we say we're holding the line, and yet it only appears sometimes that we're conservative when we're in the minority. And that's really a good question. Are we to be conservative all of the time or only when we're in the minority? Now, some will say we must govern. And my question about governing is, does governing mean abandoning one's principles? Does governing mean that we are just going to be senseless and spend and throw money at every problem? Some have said this is a great deal because it's bipartisan, but really in some ways it's a bipartisan compromise in the wrong direction. Both sides have come together and said we'll spend more money on the sacred cow that each side wants, but in reality the person that gets shafted is the taxpayer and the next generation that's going to be burdened with his debt. There are some procedural ways we could try to avoid this. We could all just do the right thing, but that hasn't seemed to work for decade after decade. There are ideas such as the Government Shutdown Prevention Act, and what it would do is it would say that if the appropriation committees don't do their job, if they have 12 months to actually come up with an appropriation bill and then the deadline comes and in 12 months they haven't done their job, what would happen is the government wouldn't shut down, the government would continue spending money, but it'd be at 1% less than they'd been spending money. And I think you have to have that hammer. You have to have some kind of punishment for not doing your job. And the punishment here would be that we'd slow down the rate of growth of government, slow it down, 1% cut. Doesn't sound enormous, but if you actually had a 1% cut annually in the budget, you actually balance your budget within about 5 years. So a 1% cut would actually be pretty dramatic and actually going in the right direction. For those who don't want to cut spending, the 1% cut would be an incentive to do their job, to actually, process the appropriation bills and have them come out. Even if we only did 6 out of the 12 appropriation bills, only 1/2 of the government would cut down. So every appropriation bill that is actually brought through committee and brought to the floor is one step in the right direction and makes it less likely that we would have a complete shutdown. So I think that drawing attention to how much debt we're accumulating is something that is important. Some will say that this was a mistake to have this debate today. This debate could have been shortened and could have been finished by noon today had we been granted 15 minutes to have one amendment. So I think part of the process is even if we were going to do the appropriation bills the way many of us would like, I think they should come to the floor and we should have a week or two of amendments. It's the most important thing we're supposed to be doing. Why couldn't we have amendments? We do sort of the opposite now. We wait to the very last minute. So we've waited all week long to put this at the very end of the week and let it expire towards the end as people get tired. And then everybody says, well, you don't want to shut down government, do you? And I really don't. My intention has never been to shut down government. But my intention is also not to keep it open and borrowing $1 million a minute. And my intention is not to vote for bills that say, oh, it's just keeping it open, but bills that actually spend so much money that I think they endanger our security. There have been those who say that the greatest threat to our national security is actually our debt. I think that's true. And I think if we don't rectify this, if we don't fix our broken system, if we don't show the American public that we can function in a way better than lurching from deadline to deadline, I think eventually the American people are going to catch on that maybe they need some new people if we can't do it in an appropriate fashion. But I see no reason on the first day of the legislature that our leadership couldn't sit in the chair and say to everyone, we're going to do all 12 appropriation bills individually. We'll spend 3 months in the committee on all of them. We'll bring them to the floor and we'll do a week or two on every bill. And that would be the primary thing we did during the entire year. But we would review all the spending to make sure we're not wasting the money, to make sure there's not programs in there that are wasteful. Right now we're going through a Pentagon audit. Instead of actually enforcing things on the Pentagon to spend better, we're actually just giving the Pentagon a pile of more money. And so the recent audit had $800 million that was missing or lost. That's a large amount of money. The recent audit also says that there's over $100 billion that actually was spent in a wasteful manner. I would think we would want to take something like that, go through the appropriations process and try to fix the spending. But you'll never get less waste if you give people more money. So really the bottom line is you have to give people less money. If you give people more money, they'll continue to waste it at the same rate. You can say we're rooting out waste, but if you're always increasing the amount of money you give people, there'll be more waste. There are some departments of government that should be completely cut down, eliminated. So I think there's a lot that can be done, but none of this is happening now. When we glom all the spending together in one enormous bill, there's not enough time to read it, and if there are no amendments, there's no way or no process to go through and try to reform government. So I think this has been a very useful debate, and my hope is that those who mutter and say, gosh, why are we having to do this so late at night, will say, why do we do it at all this way? And why can't next year we do it in a better way? Or why can't we begin to do the process of actually sending bills through committee and debating them in a normal fashion? So I, for one, think that this is an important debate and that the future of our country hinges on how much debt we're accumulating. And I hope those who look at this bill, who actually truly do believe that debt is a problem, will consider saying enough's enough and I'm not voting for more debt. Thank you.